A recent vote in Switzerland was a pretty sharp reminder that climate policies can be costly in more ways than one. They come with political costs as well. The Swiss love direct democracy and referendums, and they had a couple on climate change and environmental policies. And many of the government's proposals and laws and policies were rejected. So, what does that mean? It has prompted Jack Mintz to raise this question. What does your climate policy cost? Of course, that really is important here because we're about to head into election. At least that's what most people think. So Dr. Jack Mintz, one of Canada's most distinguished and influential academics in public policy, and of course, respected economist, you're the one, Jack, that was posing the question. And you want this you want voters to be thinking about this as the ballot question. What is your climate policy cost? What provoked this? Was it the Swiss event?
Well, I think there's been more than just a Swiss event in the past several years, but I think it was a good example to talk about because it was a very recent one. And the Swiss, do care about their environment. They love their place, and it's a beautiful country. I've been there myself. But it was very interesting that, despite the government pushing very strongly some carbon policies to meet their 2030 targets, which are not as aggressive as Canada's, by the way, that the two proposals that they had, which included an airline ticket fee as well as a fuel tax increase, got defeated by kind of a close margin, it was 52 to 48 roughly, but it got defeated, which indicates that the public really isn't quite there yet in order to understand that they're going to be ending up paying more for a lot of things as we go through this energy transition. And that's the reason why I've raised this issue, because I think it's government's faults right now, because they have not been honest with the public about what is the kind of costs that they could be facing. It's going to be higher energy costs. It's going to be higher automobile costs, potentially. There's huge changes that are going to be done to transmission lines and to a whole bunch of other things that are going to end up costing money, and they have to be paid for in some way. And it's either going to be through taxes or it's going to be through higher rate charges paid to, let's say, electricity users, et cetera.
Well, there was an interesting little story this week, just kind of on that point, that you have the Environment Minister, Mr. Wilkinson, saying, without real evidence, but stating that there are 180,000 new green jobs created. And then when quizzed and when you go to other departments, nobody really has any knowledge of that or even an accurate way to assess it. Is there some way that we can assess new green jobs that might replace the old oil jobs?
Well, there are two things about that I think, again, are problematical. And I've gone through their models. The Environment Department, I think it's now called Environment and Climate Change.
Yes.
Canada uses what is called a general equilibrium model to assess the impact of climate change policies on the Canadian economy.
Explain that.
I'm going to right now. This is a mathematical model with a whole bunch of equations. Actually, it's kind of based on U.S. work. And what they do is they try to include all sorts of markets, and the fact that you have to have, balancing, let's say, like the demand for labor has to be equal to the demand for the supply of labor, and that determines what the wage rate is going to be and that sort of stuff. And that model, though, it's a mathematical model, basically, and you plug in some numbers, but that's not really a prediction. It doesn't give you a prediction at all. It's just, you just twist the model and you say what happens based on the model, but it's not necessarily going to be a forecast. What's going to be really happen to the economy, because you have to do a lot more work to really fully understand all the implications. It's not that easy to do. The other thing about the model is that it totally ignores capital market mobility internationally. And I think they actually underestimate the costs associated with that model, because when you put a tax on energy, it will drive down the demand for capital and capital investment. And that will cause, in their model, that causes the rate of return on capital to fall, which is a boon to the manufacturing industry and other industries that are using capital. But in a very open economy like Canada's, where the world interest rate is not determined by anything that we do as a country, we're only 3% of the world market, we don't have an impact on the interest rate, the world interest rate. And so there's going to be no boon to the manufacturing industry if you put a tax on energy. In fact, it'll be the opposite. They will have higher costs on energy, and they will end up cutting back their investment and their job creation. So the model itself is not even a good characterization of the Canadian economy. And so I don't really trust it. The second point I want to make, which I think is really important, is we're too focused on jobs, and we're not focused on incomes that come from jobs. And we have to remember that
great point.
The highest paid people of all the sectors in the economy is actually in oil and gas extraction. The workers actually get really good incomes. And if you end up displacing those jobs and put them in jobs where they pay less, you may actually have people fully employed, and that may take many years to do that. You may have that, but they're going to be paid less. And that's something which people forget about. And
look, we've seen this here with the slowdown in the patch in Alberta and in the province of Saskatchewan. These are many, men and women, primarily men, that work on the rigs and have very high-paying jobs. They come back to small town Saskatchewan, buy homes, put their kids in hockey, buy a truck, do all that, get their groceries, and all that. I mean, I don't know how that's captured anywhere, but I'm telling you, it's had a huge impact in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan.
And yes, it has. But I think the main point is that, we are going to go through a transition. And I think what's really important is to try to minimize the costs associated with that transition. And that's what's missing in a lot of the work that's done right now coming out of the government. They don't show paths of how to get to 2050. I mean,
correct.
You have a discussion about whether 2050 is realistic, but to have net zero. But let's we accept it, because I can tell you that some of the earlier models didn't assume that we would have net zero by 2050. That only became a promise, and now everyone's working towards it. We don't know whether that's actually the right promise in terms of the best path. But let's assume that should be the target. Then the question is, how do you achieve it at the lowest cost? And to give you a good example, Canada is actually going to one of the highest carbon prices in the world by 2030. $170 a ton.
Yeah.
And I would actually argue that's not a bad policy. In fact, I'm a great believer in carbon pricing.
You are, and we're going to go to that in just a moment, but go ahead.
But, in being an efficient way, but it's not the only way to get to the target. But what you can do is you can end up piling on policy after policy that could end up being very expensive. And to give you a good example is the clean fuel standard or regulation.
Right.
That's just going to raise the price of diesel and gasoline and fuel products at the pump, just like what a carbon tax is going to do. So you have to ask the question, why are we putting on this whole administrative, complex system on top of the carbon tax? What is it giving us except for more costs associated with trying to administer the system, as well as imposing costs in the economy that we can't do with the carbon tax? And in fact, the carbon tax at least gives you some revenue that goes back to people to offset the cost of the carbon tax. Well, the clean fuel standard won't do that at all. It just raises the price, and the poor are going to be paying higher heating costs and transportation costs, and there's no offset for them. So why are we doing it this way? It makes no sense. And one of my favorite studies that's been done is by New Zealand, where they looked at what kind of paths they could take to try to get to net zero by 2050. And they had 3 plans. The first plan was just simply rely on the carbon tax, which they said would have to be about $800. I forget if that was in New Zealand or American dollars, but $800, to get there by 20. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, and they had like a 14% loss in GDP associated with it. So they said, well, if we invest in new technologies, which frankly, I think this is the answer, but if we invest in new technologies, of which one of them, by the way, was vaccination for what they call animal husbandry, the sheep, and
Yeah.
so that they would have fewer methane emissions. That would actually cut the overall cost to the economy of getting to the path, as well as achieve something in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And I think there's an important lesson to that, and that is we need to look at what are the technology, how we can get technologies to reduce emissions, and basically rely on carbon pricing really as a way of trying to maybe finance those technologies.
I mean, we're seeing this in the sector, and we've been seeing it there for 20 or 30 years, especially with oil sands technology and their extraction method, which uses very small footprints and very little water. Pardon me. Like, it's not that the industry isn't doing these things; it's in their own interest to do this.
Well, yes, the industry is actually doing quite a bit. That's what people don't realize. In fact, on new oil sand projects with the kind of new technologies that are available, the actual greenhouse gas emissions associated with the new technologies per unit of barrel is no different than the average barrel of oil landed in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an important point. It used to be 17% premium. Does it create more emissions? Yes, it does. There's no question about that. But there are things that the industry can do in that regard. And then, of course, there could be investments in carbon capture and storage, which is, according to the Stanford Modeling Group, is going to be absolutely required in order to meet the 2050 net zero emission goal, is that we're going to have CCS worldwide, and using more hydrogen and things like that in order to get to net zero. And so I think when you kind of look at even what people are projecting as the kind of technologies that are going to be needed, and there's going to be a whole host of them. It's not any single
Right.
one. That there's things to be done.
The small nuclear reactors seem to be an answer that some of the provinces are coming up with. We've had this debate in Saskatchewan forever and ever. I think maybe the federal minister is not keen on the nuclear option, but we're going to have to incorporate that if we're going to meet some standards.
Yes, that's going to be another option. In fact, even the Stanford Modeling Group, which, by the way, I mentioned them because I read several papers that there's published in scientific journals. And this is 18 groups that get together with their models, energy models, to try to assess actually which are the ones that could achieve getting to a certain target and at the lowest cost possible, which is the kind of work that we should be doing in Canada, which we're not doing right now. And they have room for nuclear. Nuclear is going to be required. You're going to need more wind and solar, no question about it. You're going to need carbon capture and storage. There isn't one technology alone that's going to deal with trying to get down to net zero emissions.
Just answer, if you can, for me a parochial question here. I'm in Saskatchewan, sitting here, court rulings over the years on carbon tax. Saskatchewan then proposed its provincial plan to Ottawa, as other provinces have done, New Brunswick and Quebec, and we were rejected, offering things like more carbon capture and small nuclear reactors, etc. Is there any reason that plan was not accepted that you can figure out, or are we just playing politics on the verge of an election?
Well, maybe I'm not. Haven't been part of the discussions or but one of the things I read, which I think concerns me, is the fact that Saskatchewan, like Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, wanted to lower their gas tax, their fuel tax, while bringing in higher carbon taxes. And frankly, I think that's a good policy. That's not a wrong policy. In fact, years ago, Nancy Hochweiler had recommended we try to change the federal fuel excise tax, which really shouldn't exist because it was just interfering with what provinces were already doing. But to change the federal fuel tax into a broad-based environmental tax, which could be like a carbon tax. In fact, Nancy and I said that instead of raising $5 billion in revenue with a fuel tax at the federal level, you could raise $20 billion under a carbon tax at $40 a ton. And so it's a much bigger base.
Yeah.
But it would mean that you would lower the gas tax because and try to make it consistent with other fuels if you wanted to, let's say, go to $30 or something like that. So I think Saskatchewan and New Brunswick and P are absolutely right. There's no reason not to try to take a more integrated approach between the fuel tax and the carbon tax, if that's desired, if one wants to have a less, let's say, a less distorting type system, which you're punishing or the use of one particular fuel rather than other ones, including, for example, you have higher taxes on diesel and gasoline, yeah, natural gas that could be used in automobiles and heating. So, those are examples, but there's no reason to think of it.
And very punitive of the agriculture sector here too, right? That's the other issue, which is not only do we feed the country, but huge swaths of the world as well. And if you make that such an expensive process, you're going to have production reductions, right?
Well, as a matter of fact, I think we should be really following a completely different approach on the federal provincial side in Canada. And that is, we should basically have something like a Paris Agreement between the federal government and the provinces. Federal government can specify an overall target they want to get to, agreed upon by the provinces. Each of the provinces can then work out their own plan based on their own economy and needs and their politics to deal with getting to the target. And there's no reason that everybody has to have the same carbon price, or everybody has to have the same clean fuel standard or whatever. There's no reason to do that.
But that's sort of what we have, which is, it's just that some provinces are being allowed to have their own system and others aren't.
Well, my point is that there's a bit of allowing for that. Like, you can choose between a cap and trade system and a carbon tax.
Right.
But why have a single price? Why do you have to have pricing? If a province doesn't want to have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, that could be their decision, as long as they get to the target in some other way. I would recommend myself carbon pricing, but I don't see any reason why why the federal government has to foist down the throats of the provinces a specific plan. They can leave the plan to the provinces as long as the province agrees to the target, and it will be penalized if they don't make the target.
So your suggestion in this recent piece that you wrote, you basically put it this way, which is governments should put a price on environmental damage and let the market best figure out then how to reduce the damage. And it was, I was just listening to, or reading actually, a speech that Governor Schwarzenegger had given recently on the environment, where he said, look, we're just, like, your people are shutting it all out because you're talking about the end is nigh. When you call something an existential crisis, it means that we're all going to die. And if we just talked about pollution, that's something that everybody can get their head around and that nobody likes, and we all collectively want to fix it. So is that what you're kind of trying to get the people to focus on, putting a price on environmental damage, not some threat that exists out there that we have no real evidence for?
Well, I think in the case of the price, there is an argument that that if you put a price on environmental damage, whether it's NOxes, SOxes, whatever the type of damage. We had sulfur, remember, and acid rain,
right,
which we did use pricing, by the way, for that. But if you put a price on it, people will then respond to it, and they'll work out the technologies and other measures that make most sense to deal with it. And frankly, governments can't pick the technologies; they don't know which technologies are going to work out there and which ones aren't. And that's why I do like pricing from that point of view. But the other thing about pricing and the impact on environmental issues is that you don't drive down the environmental costs or environmental damage to zero. In other words, You just,
Right.
in other words, there's still going to be some environmental damage. It's just that you're weighing the cost of reducing the damage relative to the benefits of certain actions that are taking the causes of damage. So, for example, if you have a mining company that has spillage in a river, you put on environmental tax to clean up this, the spillage and things like that, but you don't put on the tax to drive out completely mining and which has some benefit to society.
I just want to come back to this issue for a moment of where we started, which is everybody kind of laying their cards on the table and using election campaign. We all know that's maybe not the best place to do it, but it's a reason to ask the question. Is anybody costing the cost of their proposals or their plans? Is anybody doing it in this country?
No, no one's doing it. I mean, in fact, what I find really terrible right now is that people are just clinging to one policy after another in order to reach a target, but have no clue what it means to the economy, the costs, and how much people are going to end up paying more in taxes or in higher prices in order to comply. And that's why I've argued that we need to have, and this will take a lot of work. It's not something that's easy to be done, but it is done, like the Stanford Modeling Group that I just mentioned earlier on. But we need to have that kind of research going on by governments and to think about how they're going to do it. And it's very interesting. The Group of 30, which is co-chaired by Mark Carney and Janet Yellen, came out with a report last week and did talk about the sensitivity of the politics. I think even those people that push very hard the climate change agenda understand that there could be a backlash against it. And we've seen that backlash happen in Switzerland. We've seen it happen in Japan. And we've seen it happen in some other countries too, that once you start seeing these much higher prices, people start resenting it. And of course, we also saw it in Ontario. There was a government that basically lost an election over electricity prices. And those electricity prices were pushed up because of the sole source contracts that were given in the previous decade, huge, expensive contracts that were given for solar and wind production that eventually had to be paid for by somebody. And of course, somebody ended up being the poor ratepayer.
Yeah, the taxpayer, for sure. When you look at these numbers, and it's the other thing it's hard to get your head around in terms of the cost, but the recent stats from Canada Action Group. So between the year 2000 and 2018, the oil and gas sector contributed $500 billion to government revenues. So that doesn't really go directly in anybody's pocket, but it does pay for healthcare, and it does pay for roads, and it does pay for lots of other social programs. That's the other side of the cost too, which is revenue not generated.
Well, let me tell you about my forthcoming article, which
okay, good.
Just a little bit about this. But and I have written about this in the past.
Yeah.
Well, governments collect a lot of fuel tax revenues. They're now collecting carbon tax revenues that are growing. Right. Those are going to be disappearing under the energy transition. But so will oil and gas royalties and a whole bunch of other payments that are made by the fossil fuel industry. So the question is, how is the government going to make up for that revenue? And so I think you're going to see electric vehicle taxes. After all, they cause damage to roads. Why if you don't have fuel tax, then tax them in a different way. In fact, the UK is already looking at having a road tax on electric vehicles based on the distance they drive each year. And there's some Australian states that have recently put road taxes on electric vehicles. And so you're going to see there's going to be, with that energy transition, some new taxes that are going to come in that are going to raise the cost of using, whether it's electric vehicles or whether it's renewable energy or anything like that. Governments cannot keep shelling out subsidies in order for people to try to twist people into purchasing these things. They're going to end up having to yank away the subsidies, but they're also going to have to put more taxes on them because even with the cost of the subsidies, it won't make up for the loss of taxes.
Well, I read this, you were talking about Mark Carney's report. I read his words the other day on electric vehicles. Now, That's a bigger issue in a place like Saskatchewan where it's 40 below and it's not clear that these things actually work. But with great distances, there is no charging station between where I live and either of the two airports in this province, about a 3 hour drive, roughly speaking. So there was a line which said we're going to need charging stations everywhere. Okay, who pays? Is that a public utility? Is that going to be a private sector operation? These kinds of questions. Thoughts on how we even go about having that discussion?
Well, I think it should be private. I think just like gasoline stations, you know,
Hmm.
that we've had over the years. That's been the infrastructure. I think that companies that are going to be offering energy for electric vehicles are going to have to build charge stations, and they will charge people for putting in a wire in order to charge up their car. And I think that should be private. I don't think the government should be paying for that. The governments right now are subsidizing these charge stations because they're trying to get the infrastructure built
Right.
that people will have confidence into buying electric vehicles. But as I said, governments cannot afford to keep throwing out money all the time.
No, exactly. And in rural areas,
Yeah.
where I live, I mean, there is not going to be a private sector incentive to have a charging station every half hour when there are no people there, relatively speaking. You get it in downtown Toronto or downtown Vancouver, but in farming communities, there's no incentive.
Well, they must have a gas station right now in their plan.
Well, they do, but I mean, you go 50 miles, like that's
I
the,
know that you have long distances, and that's a
yeah,
problem. There is an issue like that, and I'm not sure how you deal with it. But even you also have the old technology versus the new technology.
right.
So I live in a condo right now in Toronto. It's a terrific place, but it's not wired in the parking system for
Correct.
for electricity. So we're going to have to put in all new electrical system in eventually in the parking lot, which is going to cost money,
Mhm.
and the condo owners are going to have to pay for it. And so, unless you put in ones that could be recovered, but I don't think you can do it if everyone has to have an electric vehicle. And
Yeah.
something is going to have to happen, which
Yeah, I
adds
think
just
that's
a
where
little
people,
bit of these costs that are all going to
yeah,
be piling in, and people don't realize this. And I think governments have got to get more honest with the public. But this is going to cost money. Not try to make it
yeah.
sound like this is going to be a boon to the economy if we end up having this energy transition. It's
Well,
total.
that's the thing. When the condo owners get their bill and say, "Oh, you've got a $700 surcharge this year because we're starting to, rip apart the garage and rewire and do all of this." I mean, I've got friends in Toronto who were trying to sell their home and they've got on-street parking, which is the case in many urban settings. And the couple owned a electric car and they said, "We want to buy the house, but we can't. There's nowhere to plug it in."
Yeah, that's another example.
Yeah, it's just
Issues
on
are
the the mega projects. There was another piece and I think this came basically from Shell, but another group called Wood Mackenzie. That and this all the while we're talking about transition, I think everybody has agreed to that. We are going to be transiting away from a carbon economy into something else, the details of which are not yet particularly clear, but that we're going to see still global oil consumption increase in this particular study by 7 million barrels a day up to and including 2030. Demand for LNG, it is growing. Even during the lockdowns, that was growing. So we've got some declines in consumption, but we've also got growing demand. Everybody around the world seems to be involved in new energy projects except us. We've kind of paused everything. That of course has to do with the investors' decisions too, but are we missing the short-term boat?
Oh, we are missing the short-term vote. I've been thinking of LNG as a perfect example of that. I mean,
Yeah,
we don't have a project yet that's been
right.
built. We've been we talked about it for over a decade, and we still don't have one in place. We have one that probably will get in place in this decade, but we've already missed years of income that could have come to Canadians and tax revenues to governments that is not available because of what we've done. Right now, there's been a dearth of investment worldwide in energy, partly because of the pandemic year, and certainly we've seen it in Canada, where the oil and gas sector is uncertain about the future of oil and gas. When you have a federal government that keeps on saying that they don't want to see any more oil and gas development, so why would you build another greenfield oil sand plant or greenfield, even conventional oil type project and things like that, if you're not going to be able to sell your product to the market? Yeah, we also have what people forget about is called depletion. This is when you take oil and gas, or in the case of coal or any other non-renewable, out of the ground. You cannot replace it unless you find some more.
Right.
But people forget about that by 2040, the proven reserves we have worldwide today will only support about 20% of the consumption that we have today. In other words, if we're consuming we're going up to 100 million barrels of oil across the world today, we'll only have enough proven reserves. If there's no replacement of those reserves,
if we're not developing them,
we'll only be down to 20 million barrels. So we're going to need some more investment. But if we stop investment entirely, is what we have been doing in Canada, then that's going to take us out of the boat. And everybody else is still going to be trying to replace their reserves. And even if there's no growth in total demand, there's still going to be a need for investment in that sense. And so, and at the same time, we'll miss the profits. And those profits could be used to go into the energy transition. And in fact, everyone knows that we're not going to have an energy transition unless we have a vibrant oil and gas sector. Anyway, in the meantime, the oil and gas sector.
I'm not sure everybody knows that, Jack.
Well, we should know that, because that's where your scientists are. You have a lot of highly technical, skilled people that could go into some of the replacement industries that we need for the fossil fuel sector. And at the same time, with the profits that are being made, that money could be rolled into alternative investments, whether it's carbon capture and storage or other renewable investments or whatever, which some of the large companies are starting to do now in the oil and gas sector. But that's why I like the idea of carbon pricing. It's very neutral. It doesn't tell people what to do. We just simply put a price on it and then let people respond.
You want to use it. And if you don't.
Exactly.
Yeah. Two questions come up from that, because I we hear this all the time, that we're sitting here on all of these reserves that are not being developed. And meanwhile, in Eastern Canada, in Quebec and other places, we're importing oil from Saudi Arabia and Nigeria and other questionable source countries, when we've got the very cleanest in terms of international comparisons of oil and gas extraction. So why are we doing that? And then the other issue that popped in my head when you're talking about LNG is the Nisga'a and other native groups, Aboriginal groups, have been negotiating with governments to be part of this action. It's their land and their resource, and they want to have part of it, and developers are recognizing that they do have to share this. So all the while that we're promising Indigenous groups that they are going to be part of this economy, we're killing the projects or slowing down the projects that might give them the funds they need.
Well, those are all good examples, and there's no reason why we should be doing that. We should be looking at what we can develop right now, but because the demand's there. Because if we don't do it, somebody else will do it in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, one of the biggest concerns now is North America going to kill off its oil and gas sector? And this is true of the United States as well, not just Canada.
Yep, for sure.
Are we going to do it, but then leave it basically to OPEC and Russia and everyone else But and it's just it's still, I just find it absolutely amazing that Joe Biden, who promised he would look at Keystone XL and not kill it immediately, he made that promise to our prime minister, and he didn't follow through. He killed it right away. But
Yeah.
he's really quite happy to let Nord Stream 2 being built to help Germany with natural gas. And there, all of a sudden, the climate change agenda didn't matter that much. Some other issues mattered. But in the case of Canada, we ended up getting, I think, badly treated by the government. And frankly, I'm very disappointed that our own government did very little. They sure made a big fuss over aluminum and steel tariffs, but they certainly did not react on Keystone.
Well, that's the problem with politics infiltrating everything. If you don't like Donald Trump, you make a fuss, and if you like Joe Biden, then you bite your tongue. I mean, it's astounding to me that, along with you here, when Biden agrees to a Russian pipeline. I mean, this is just, it's mind-boggling, not only strategically, but just putting their money where their mouth is on environmental issues.
Well, but also if North America does not have, it does not allow its oil and gas sector to replace its reserves and stops development entirely, we're just giving up very important leverage to the rest of the world, when actually instead North America could be an exporter, not an importer of oil and gas entirely. And that could be lost entirely. Now, Americans at least have a number of LNG plants that they have built and are doing well. And but that was under previous regimes. And of course, politics in the U.S. could change very quickly. And the next part of this decade could be very different than the first part of this decade.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't let you go without getting your thoughts on a few straight up economic issues here. We're hearing Jerome Powell at the Fed say inflation is going up, that these price increases are real, that people better pay attention. We've got the other half of the coin saying, oh no, it's just COVID and supply chain related, and there'll be a little bump and then it's going to go back. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've been saying for some time in other pieces I've written that what's the important thing to recognize with this pandemic is that it was a supply shock. People were told not to work or to stay home. And it wasn't because of lack of demand, it was because of the supply shock. Now we're coming back out of it, but I think there's going to be some significant changes to the economy where some jobs may not come back and people are going to have to find new ones. That takes quite a while to sort out that unemployment. It's called what you call structural unemployment. Now, in the meantime, governments, particularly the United States, but also Canada, has operated like as if this is a demand shock. And so they've been carrying out big stimulus packages, Biden's $1.9 trillion recently. But even in our case, we spent a huge amount of money in 2020. I don't, no one disagrees that we had to do something. Right. But we actually increased personal incomes in Canada by 10% during
and the savings rate went up to prove it.
And so now we have all this pent up demand, which is just going to fan inflation. While at the same time, we're still going to have this unemployment operating in the system. And so the big question, and the Federal Reserve and both the Bank of Canada, as well as the Bank of Canada, say, well, this is only temporary. And yes, we're going to have a blip in inflation rate now, but eventually it will come down to 2%. And the question is, how long is temporary? Right. And it looks like temporary may now be 2 to 3 years temporary. In other words, 3 years of relatively robust inflation. In the meantime, the question is whether people's wages are going to go up to match that inflation. And I was looking at the numbers recently. In fact, that's going to be probably the piece I'm going to do soon this month. But I was looking at the average wage increase since in Canada since December of 2020. In other words, the last 6 months in 2021. There's been hardly any increase in the average wage rate. But inflation is over 3%.
Right.
So it's like a 3% tax on people. And we're paying more for bread, we're paying more for automobiles, we're paying more for
Lumber.
lumber, housing, uh, gasoline. I mean, I know
Yep.
when my gasoline costs are now close to $1.40. When 4 or 5 months ago, they were closer to $1.10. So
Yeah.
you are looking at much higher prices now, and at some point, people are going to be really feeling squeezed. A lot of middle class and lower income people are going to feel squeezed. Some low income people are going to be well protected by indexed pensions and indexed transfers that they get from the federal and provincial governments. They automatically go up with inflation, which means
Mhm.
budgets, deficits are going to go up more. But there's a lot of people on fixed incomes. Elderly have fixed incomes, and the rates of return they're getting on bonds and things like that is terrible. And the stock market, yeah, it's done really well over the past year, but how long is that going to continue?
Yeah.
So
We've heard so much discussion, about, I hate to even give it a name, but modern monetary theory. And we've spoken to people on this program and others about, the merits of this theory, which is just you don't need to worry about government spending and government borrowing and banks backstopping all of that because interest rates are low, and so it's cheap to borrow and it's cheap to fund all these things. But as you say, there's got to be some pressure point eventually on interest rates here, and maybe sooner than we think.
what monetary, leaving aside the macroeconomic modeling on money supply,
Yeah.
just for a moment, in a micro world, if governments spend more and tax less and create bigger deficits, that will cause demand to go up. And if you don't have enough supply coming in, that's going to cause prices to rise if supply can't keep up to demand. And that's the situation we're in right now. Now, with monetary policy, the argument is that the Bank of Canada is holding the federal government's debt, and if you consolidate the two, it really is no different. But actually, that's a bit of a kind of twisting on
Sleight of hand here, which
sleight of hand or angels dancing on a pin.
yeah.
The big question is whether banks start lending more. Because the Bank of Canada, when they take on government debt, they end up putting more reserves in the banks. And the banks have, in the past, some of the banks haven't raised their lending, and so that didn't pump up the economy.
Right.
The question is whether the banks will start lending more as a result, and that will happen if there's demand increasing in the economy. The banks will give money to companies that are trying to increase their supply or trying to deal with the expensive raw materials that are now coming in, and which is leading to higher unit costs of production. So I think that actually modern monetary theory is really no different than monetary theory, and there's really nothing to it. And really, what we're now going through is a very different phase than what we did, back in 2008-9 when we had the financial crisis. That was a totally different story.
But what we're hearing from governments, certainly both stateside and here, is about the Great Reset that COVID has allowed us in many ways, obviously, governments to do things they might not have been able to get away with before. But it's time for a rethink, and people are now engaged in how it works. We've figured out crossing borders is difficult. We've figured out, federal provincial relations are confused, et cetera. Is there going to be some great reset, or are we just going to have to figure this out issue by issue as we go and run up against it?
Well, I think the question is, what do we mean by reset?
Yeah.
I think the public right now is really interested in getting over this pandemic, getting back to where they were, and being able to work and enjoy life, things like that. And I'm not sure they're totally ready for a completely reordering of society that people maybe on the progressive side think they are ready for. I mean, I had to read something for one of our agencies in Canada on a task force that people wrote. They had everything, redoing long-term care, redoing childcare, redoing this, redoing that. All that is going to cost money. At the same time, we've got an energy transition that's going on that's going to be cost billions of dollars. And so I think in the end, I'm not sure the public is going to be ready to pay much higher taxes for a lot of the things. And in fact, I think they would like to have security, and they would like to get back to where they were. Not,
Just
I
some
don't think they're looking
normalcy.
for
Yeah,
recess.
very, very, very sensible, Jack. So good to talk to you. Thank you for your time. As always, you walk us through this with great ease. And remember Jack's question that he wants to see voters asking of their political leaders, what does your climate policy cost? I think that's a pretty great question. Jack Mintz, one of Canada's most distinguished academics in public policy, an economist, and you are the President's Fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. And I can't even list all the other titles that you have, but there are many. Thanks again for joining us on No Nonsense.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jack. So that is it for this edition of No Nonsense. We'll talk to you again very soon. Bye bye for now.